Well, let's begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Jesus, help us to be enlightened. Do you exist or not? Help us to explore honestly, but forthrightly, all the arguments, pro and con, and put hope that you are God and that you do exist. We pray these things in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Due to some interesting circumstances, could you help me out? Do me a favor. I don't know exactly where I'm going to be when I'm going to be correcting these. So, what I'd like you to do is, again, keep your notes over to the right. A reflection paper is going to be always over to the left. These 2A notes don't have a reflection paper. But this is what I would like you to do. I would like you, like usually there's a term that is underlined in my notes that is pretty primary. Um, Argument from ignorance, principle of causality, Protagoras, something. What I'd like you to do is to start your input there, and if you would either highlight it or make it bold, and then do your explanation of the facts. Then skip a line between those two, and then again your second item to bold it, make it easier for me to see and read. When it's all bunched together, it really slows me down, and I'm going to need some streamlining to do. So thank you. A bit of a review from our last test, which we were talking about a search for truth. Does truth exist? I presented four different philosophies, not Christians, not Jewish philosophies, general philosophical philosophies from Greek philosophers. The most closely aligned with the Catholic Church, of course, is Socrates and his student Aristotle. Uh, when asked, did matter matter? Yes. Was it real? Sure. Did the mind exist? Yes. Was a soul real? Yes, and it mattered. But he had a student, Plato, who was our apostle of idealism, who said, no, material stuff, it's an illusion. He agreed with that we have a mind and that we have a soul, but he did not agree with the material realities. Versus Epicurus, our materialist, he went the opposite direction. He said the only truth that can be found is in the material world. The mind and the soul, no, not so much. And then we have our relativist, Mr. Protagoras, down here, who everything was relative to him. If I say it is, then it is. Now you have to ask, well, would the seven moons around the planet Uranus exist if you didn't think and say it existed? So there's some problems with relativism, but the point is, I'm trying to bring us back to this issue, the law of non-contradiction. Four separate philosophies with different positions. The law of contradiction, which is A can't be B at the same time in the same place, says only one has the potential of being really true. The other three are flawed and are not true and will not lead us. Um, and so here we are in the theory of non-contradiction. Okay, thank you. This section will deal with the question of does God exist? So we're going to talk a lot about something like the Big Bang. How did it happen? But when we talk about God's existence, we're going to be using arguments, and here is a foundational truth. No matter which argument I come up with, I cannot, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, no one can come up with a definitive argument that will absolutely prove the existence of God. I believe I have arguments that give strong credence to that idea, but I cannot, nor do I claim to be able to produce absolute proof. But on the other hand, neither can the non-theist say with assurance and absolute proof that God does not exist. Therefore, all of these arguments that we're going to deal with have, if you will, holes in the bucket or chinks in their armor. I need to introduce you to the idea of the arguments from ignorance. The argument from ignorance says if A is unproven and you use it in an argument, well, then really A really proves absolutely at least nothing. It may give great credence, but it doesn't absolutely prove it. So as a result, a lot of the arguments in apologetics go this way. The materialist will say to the theist, you are simply using a God in the gap argument. You are simply inserting God into your argument, but you can't prove what you just said, that God is or didn't do it or did do it. And likewise, then the theist will say right back to the materialist, look, you're merely using a nature in the gap argument. You're inserting some form of matter or energy or nature into your argument, but you have no absolute proof of that. Well, in that sense, then, all of these arguments are somewhat arguments from ignorance. So what can and does happen is that we can compare the verses, the evidence, and see which one is the strongest. Okay, and again, as I'm saying, that's where we're going to go. Well, we'll deal with a general class of arguments that are called the cosmological arguments. And the cosmological arguments deal with this question. We're going to be referring to the Big Bang a bunch, but the question there pre-Bang. In other words, if to the best of our knowledge, the Big Bang is where the universe begins, the question is, well, what was the first cause of the Big Bang? If you will, what banged the bang? So that's what cosmological arguments, pro and con, are going to try to do. They're going to try to give us explanations as to how the bang got banged. Now, the term Big Bang is the popular idea. The more appropriate term is called the singularity. Ironically, this came from a Catholic priest. He's one of the pioneers of this idea. He took Einstein's relativity theories and he applied them to the universe. When he did, what he discovered was that all the matter in the universe seems to have coalesced at one point and compressed into this one single, matter, all matter and energy, super compressed, and then it exploded in an absolute beginning. And that's when we can talk about, space and time have begun, matter and energy have begun from this singularity event. Father George Lemaitre. So he's going to be an interesting piece of the puzzle. And the reason is because neither the theist nor the materialist accepts an infinite regress. Let's remind ourselves, what is an infinite regress again? That is the inability or the refusal to determine a first cause for a given thing. In other words, we hesitate to go, chicken egg, it doesn't matter, because what we know is for sure, logically, is that an actual infinity can't exist for finite things that have a beginning or an end. We know finite things do exist. You exist. This computer is finite. Well, they must be caused. And therefore, if our universe had a beginning, then it must have a first cause for this finite thing. Now, theists in one way, shape, or form are going to argue that God or gods are this uncaused first cause. Materialists are going to be stuck trying to argue that either some form of matter or energy is this uncaused first cause. So the apologetic debates between the materialist theist world are grounded. If they're going to debate, they've got to be grounded on the principle of causality. We've got to agree to that. The principle of causality is that everything that has a beginning must have a cause and an end, and that these laws of cause and effect are in play. A cause is always, for instance, greater than the effect. Because if you take away the laws of cause and effect and you take away the principle of causality, then, kiddos, no science, no logic, no mathematics are possible. You can't have a informed, logical conversation. You can't have an informed debate that weighs real evidence, because at that point, no evidence really is able to be understood or grabbed a hold of. So these principles of laws of cause and effect and principle of causality are important in apologetics. So in my class for this semester, whatever that semester is, we're going to have some data points that we're going to agree upon, that we're going to say, okay, well, that sounds pretty good. So first, the first piece of data is that there's a lot of universal agreement that the Big Bang, the singularity event, occurred some 14 billion years ago. A few million years here and there. Okay. But for our purposes, 14 billion years ago, we're going to say that we have evidence that the Big Bang occurs. And then the next piece of data that we're going to agree upon between theists and materialists is roughly there's evidence that over 10 billion years goes by since that event, the singularity event, where there is no evidence of life in the universe. So 10 billion years, the universe seems empty and devoid of any life whatsoever. And then, interestingly enough, we then, about 4 billion years ago, seem to find evidence that life has somehow begun in the universe. So the choke points for apologetic discussions are always going to be, how did the bang get banged? Okay. And how does life begin, given that there's no life in the universe for 10 billion years before that? Those are the choke points. So 14, 10, and 4 billion years ago. Those are going to be the data points we're going to work with in this course. As we lay in these foundations, I want to make sure you understand Catholics have no real problem with the Big Bang. In fact, we were kind of delighted when it kind of came around. For instance, let's take a look at the proto verse, the first verse in the Bible, Genesis 1:1. The Big Bang dovetails nicely into this. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We'll take a look at that. That lends itself nicely to the fact that God, it would then be the uncaused first cause of the universe. And again, it suggests later God just says a word, he speaks, and so therefore it's kind of created out of nothing. And that our universe would then, in fact, have an absolute beginning from God's first words. So when Father George Lemaitre came up with this, then Pope Pius XII in 1951 calls him to the Vatican and says, hey, we're going to make this an article of faith. And Father Lemaitre says, well, let's slow down, cowboy. Now we're just getting there. We just have uncovered this. We don't know what's coming next, so hold on. But as late as just a few years ago, our Pope Francis I, who recently passed away, in an official document, says, look, the Big Bang Theory does not contradict or contradict the intervention of a divine creator in the universe. In fact, the universe then depends on it. So Catholics, by and large, we don't have a huge problem with the Big Bang. Later on in Scripture, Paul is going to argue in Romans 1:20 what we will come to call the no excuses argument, or the no excuses verse, because Paul is going to argue, look, the existence of God is just a product of natural revelation. It's self-evident. He says God's existence is self-evident. For what can be known about God is evident. Ever since the creation of the world, divinity has been able to be understood in what he has made. And as a result, none of us have an excuse to not believe that God exists. We don't need a burning bush experience. We don't need the angel Michael or Gabriel to come down and inform us. We don't need, like in Lourdes, Mary to come down. No, Socrates, Augustine, Aquinas, many great thinkers. It's self-evident. Look, all we've got to look around is the intelligent design all around us. Just as when we were in class and we built block towers with 20 blocks on, no one's going to come in realistically and say, oh, gee, that just appeared. No, it was caused. It was there. Well, look around. The evidence of intelligent design, Paul is going to argue, is everywhere. we have no excuse. So let's begin to start presenting real cosmological arguments. The first is one of the earliest cosmological arguments that anyone knows about, and it is called, and it's referred to as the Kalam or Kalem argument. And it is attributed to a Islamic philosopher by the name of Al-Kindi. And so we're going to give to Al-Kindi the same date that we gave to Muhammad, roughly 600 AD. And what Al-Kindi argued was that, look, whatever begins to exist must have a cause. And if the universe had a beginning, then logically, guess what? It had to have a cause. Now, Al-Kindi's problem was, the context of it was almost no one at the time of Al-Kindi believed that the universe, that our world had an absolute beginning. Almost everybody assumed, Aristotle assumed that the world must have been eternal. So therefore, there was no real scientific evidence to suggest an absolute beginning of the universe, to even suggest it. So Al-Kindi's logic was airtight, but the facts remained elusive. The facts, but nonetheless, it's one of the earliest cosmological arguments for the existence of God. Well, Al-Kindi and Al-Kindi's world may have all presumed that the universe was eternal, but Al-Kindi's argument, all of a sudden we jump forward to the modern era, and I will present to you the BVG theorem. And pay attention to the V. The BVG stands for Borde-Vilenkin-Guth. And basically, this is a mathematical theorem, a mathematical formula that takes all of the modern mathematical skills, kind of like Father Lemaitre did, crunches them down, and lo and behold, what does the theorem say? Well, it gives mathematical support that everything in the universe that expands, that is inflationary, if you run it all back, all of that must ultimately go back to a singularity event. And the BVG theorem says it doesn't matter whether the inflationary universe is in our universe or whether it's in another dimension, which is going to be important when we get to the multiverse and the M theory. But what they did was to give a mathematical orientation. And I got to be clear on this, because if you look up BVG theorem, you'll see that there are mathematicians that say, well, if you presume something else, and if you start at a different place, and you use these kind of things. But basically, ultimately, what happens is, as we'll see from Vilenkin, this, again, was one of those unwanted proofs that more and more evidence began to emerge to support the idea of an absolute beginning at a Big Bang, such as this. So although you can't say that this absolutely proves, what it does do is, given the kind of mathematics that we are teaching at school and advanced mathematics, it gives accepted mathematical principles and formulas that you could do with your little calculators that will bring you to the same conclusion that our universe and any other universe that expands must begin with a singularity event. So it doesn't prove the Big Bang, but it gives mathematical credence and support to those who argue the point. Borde-Vilenkin. We're going to talk a little bit more about Vilenkin later. Now, in any debate about the existence of God, I would be remiss if I didn't at least expose you to St. Thomas Aquinas. In his Summa Theologica in 1250, he contains 5 logical arguments or proofs for the existence of God. Again, he never suggested they prove his existence. They just say logically, you can't go any other direction. I'm going to give you a couple of them. I'm going to start with his motion argument, which will help us to explain why people like Socrates and Augustine and the Pope and me, his motion argument. He basically just says in order for the Big Bang or the first thing to have moved, there had to be a first mover who existed before it. And that first mover, the only way for that to happen, for a finite thing to start moving, is that an infinite, unmoved, uncaused mover existed that didn't have to move because it was already there. Logically, we don't believe in anything. So the first mover exists prior to the bang, and the first mover is what we call omnipresent. Present where? Everywhere. And as a kid, you were learned, where's God? God is everywhere. Here's the kicker. When? Was God at your birth? Yes. When? Now. Is God at the Big Bang? Yes. When? Now. Is God at your deathbed? Yes. When? Now. Is God at the last coming? Yes. When? Now. So the first mover can't be tied to space and time. The first mover can't be material. It's got to be spirit. And for in essence to be the creator, it also has to have powerful mind. So Aquinas argues that the only logical way for the first domino to be knocked over is if an unmoved, uncaused first cause caused it. And we call this particular cosmological argument of St. Thomas Aquinas the motion argument. A first mover had to have existed who was unmoved and uncaused in order to move and be the first cause of the universe. Deep, huh? Yeah. Woo-hoo. Burn a few brain cells on that one. Okay, Mr. Keefe. Great theology theory, Summa Theologica. Is there any real science that helps back such ideas up? The answer is, yeah. I give you Newton's motion arguments here. We're in the motion theme here, roller coastering along. Newton's third law of motion, where he argues every action demands an equal and opposite reaction. Let me translate that. Look, if A moves, right? If A moves, an equal or greater something had to have moved it. So pre-bang, stuff had to have been necessary to exist because some thing had to exist prior to the Big Bang in order to move the Big Bang. Because the third law of motion says there are no accidents allowed. If something moved, something had to move it. We don't believe again in poof theories. Nothing moved it. It just nothing. Nor do we believe again in infinite regresses. So what Newton's third law of motion does is support Thomas Aquinas' idea of the motion argument, that something prior to the bang that doesn't move, that is omnipresent, had to be present prior to the Big Bang moving, because stuff doesn't move accidentally. If the material universe is stuff, then something had to move it. Could not move itself. Newton's third law of motion, no accidents allowed. If there was movement, something had to move it. Now, this notion is not unique to Thomas Aquinas. This notion of an omnipresent God who's always there and always present. We find it in Scripture. This is going to be important when we get to Jesus, the tetragrammaton. Tetra means 4 letters. Interesting story behind that. Exodus 3:14. This is the burning bush experience where Moses is being told by God to go and tell Pharaoh to let the people free. Moses is afraid and says, "Well, who will I tell him you are? What do you name yourself?" And God famously says, "I am who I am." Tell them I am who I am. The perfect present tense. Again, back to that notion. Does Scripture complement this idea of omnipresence? Always available, always there. Genesis 1:1. Prior to the omni Exodus 3:4. I am who I am. Always present. The perfect present tense. It is such a sacred name that our Jewish friends do not speak the whole name of God. They have over the centuries come up with derivatives, so therefore they got rid of all the vowels. That's why you sometimes see YHWH. That's the 4 letters. Tetra, 4 letters. Um, and Jesus, I'm going to refer back to this, will, if you were to claim that I am the I am, then you're claiming what? You're claiming to be God. And we're going to see how that works. So the Tetragrammaton and Thomas Aquinas's vision that the motion argument implies that there is an omnipresent, uncaused first cause. Okay, so we have spent a fair amount of time on the theistic side of the fence, the theistic cosmological arguments. So let's begin to turn our focus. What are some of the best materialistic, atheistic arguments? And to frame those arguments, we need to talk about something called scientism, which is popular today. It's a derivative of what comes to be also known as scientific materialism. So it's a derivative from Epicurus. It's scientific materialism. Scientism is an exaggerated reliance on science and material causes alone. That it's almost a presupposition that in some scientific circles, unless you can scientific materially prove this, measure this, quantify this, this thing doesn't really exist. So it's almost an overwhelming reliance on science for truth, just like I believe Epicurus relies on only those things which can be measured. So for me, this is an exaggeration. This is like saying Mount Rushmore could only have been produced by wind and erosion. Well, that would be silly. There's obviously an intelligent design to Mount Rushmore. I don't know why my little blue thing is jumping back and forth, but it's kind of interesting. So what scientism says is, as it applies then to cosmological arguments, is that the first cause can only be, catch it, 3 things: a material foundation, totally accidental, totally unguided. The Big Bang, the start of the universe, could only be a product of some sort of material, accidental, unguided process. Just got incredibly lucky. And let's see how strong those arguments are. This is one of the most well-known modern scientists that has ever lived. He's recently died. Mr. Stephen Hawking, an incredibly smart guy. He was our gentleman in the wheelchair. If you ever watched The Big Bang Theory or anything, he's very popular, bestseller, brilliant. Ironically, Stephen Hawking will come to prominence because of his discovery of something called the singularity theorem. Remember, we were talking about Bohr, Vilenkin, and Guth, and Father George Lemaitre. And there is a lot of really concrete scientific evidence for supporting the Big Bang Theory. Well, early on in Stephen Hawking's career, this brilliant guy comes up with what is called the singularity theorem. And basically, he also took, all these Einsteinian theories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and he looked at it and he applied it, did his little calculator. What did he come up with? Well, if you run the universe back in time from an expanding universe, what you get is you get to a place of a singularity. You get to a place of where there has to be a beginning, an absolute beginning. So Stephen Hawking first comes to his fame by promoting a theory that supports the Big Bang Theory, the singularity theorem. Now, Father Lemaitre, the BVG theorem, the singularity theorem, there is extensive scientific evidence that supports this notion of the Big Bang. We have discovered redshift galaxies and microwave backgrounds and the gravitational singularity. I mean, there's a lot of scientific evidence that leads us to conclude the Big Bang has, to be fair, the preponderance of scientific evidence rests with support of the Big Bang Theory, including Stephen Hawking. So what's wrong? Well, what's wrong is Stephen Hawking is an atheist. And he doesn't for a moment like the idea that his theorem is giving credence to people like Pope Pius XII, who are saying, hey, this supports the Bible. And so that framework, he's not going to be the only or the first scientist who comes up with theories that support the Big Bang, and he's going to spend a lot of years trying to come up with an alternative. But one of the alternatives can't be the poof theory. It can't be spontaneous creation, because there is also, I've got to introduce at this time, the law of nothing. And remember, a law works every time. The law of nothing is simple. From nothing comes nothing. Now, ironically, in class, I'm going to go, okay, well, if that's true, are you something? Yes. Am I something? Yes. So if nothing comes from nothing, that would imply there has always had to be something. Because if there ever truly was nothing, then nothing would exist at all. But what we want to emphasize on this slide is nothing can't be the first cause. But whatever the first cause was is another proof of why the first cause would have to have no beginning and would have to be eternal. But nothing comes from nothing. So whatever banged the bang is something, maybe not the same something as the universe, something more, something beyond the universe. See, the universe is bound by space and time. So the uncaused cause, logic will demand, probably is beyond space and time. A spirit. Okay. But Stephen Hawking understood perfectly well that his singularity theorem gave support to crazies like me who are going to come along and say, well, that complements the theories of the Bible. As you can tell, I have way too much fun doing this stuff. I introduce you to another complementary idea of where I'm headed. The law of conservation, which is the first law of thermodynamics. So we've already had the third law of thermodynamics. This is the first law. The law of conservation. Matter, energy can't be created or destroyed. So again, we're going to see how in the next argument that's put forth, the law of conservation is going to kill it. If matter can't create itself, then matter can't be the first cause. Now, ironically, that's not going to keep cowboys like Lincoln and Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss. They're going to be playing with this idea of, well, golly goodness, how do I explain this? So evidence of spontaneous creation in any form will go poof. Uh, Evidence of a material cause of the bang at at the most generous level, uh, the most generous level, given them their due, it's highly unlikely. Matter, because of things like the law of conservation, do not make for good first causes of a material universe. It's self-defeating. If you follow my little thing, it's a self-defeating argument. Matter can't create matter, but the universe is matter. So matter can't be the first cause, but a materialist needs matter to bang the bang. But matter can't create matter, but the universe is matter, and around and around we go. So I'm laying in the foundation. I'd like you to look through the mirror, look through the looking glass, watch how difficult my materialist friends have. You think my argument's hard to make? God is the creator, the first cause? Oh, I'd much prefer to be on this side of this argument. Watch all the shenanigans that they have to go through to try to get us to a place of saying, oh no, the bang could have come about by purely material, unplanned reasons. We'll see. Law of conservation, matter, energy can't be created or destroyed. The Big Bang, the material Big Bang, couldn't have created itself. Period. Remember when I told you about Vilenkin not wanting to accept his own BVG theorem results? Well, he didn't, because he understood how that would provide and support things like a absolute beginning, which then would support Genesis 1:1. So he begins to devote the better part of 10 to 15, 20 years trying to undermine the BVG theorem in a legitimate way. One of his ways was to come up with what we will call the oscillating universe argument. And at first glance, it's got some real merits to it. Here's what he argued. He thought, or he tried to create a eternal, uncaused Big Bang that would have expanded and exploded, right? But then nature would ultimately crunch down the singularity, and we would get down, 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 and then there would be another bang. And then there would be an expansion of the universe, of that universe. And then it would crunch down on itself. And then eventually these endless, endless, endless numbers would sooner or later get to our Big Bang. So here we are. And the idea is that our Big Bang will eventually crunch on down and we'll get to another. And so what you have as a theory, what if there was an endless series of bangs and crunches and bangs and crunches? Well, that would be a never ending beginning or ending material cycles. Unfortunately, after all these years, Vilenkin will come to the conclusion that, you know, those answers that he got in his early BVG theorem, they're probably right. And so let's see how he handles this. He devotes literally 10, 15 years and comes up with theoretical models that might take the place of the BVG theorem or moderate it or modify it. This oscillating universe idea spent a majority. Again, perhaps he argued that the Big Bang wasn't a one-off event, but merely one of a series of Big Bangs, creating an endless, endless number of bubble universes. So that was the idea. Unfortunately, after a number of different years, he comes to the conclusion that none of his alternative solutions seem to work. and that in the real world, his BVG mathematical principles that he had discovered way back when cannot easily be discarded. That the assumptions that you would need to discard it don't seem to exist. And he ultimately grudgingly says, when asked, the answer to the question whether the universe had a beginning is yes, it probably did. Now remember, though, the context. The BVG theorem, a set of mathematical constructs that you and I could duplicate, indicate that an inflationary universe must have an absolute beginning. The BVG theorem and Vilenkin. Well, what really doomed the oscillating universe is the law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy doomed the oscillating universe argument. The second law of thermodynamics says, look, without a lot of effort, things break down. We've coined the term entropy. Entropy. Usable energy becomes useless unless you work very, very hard. Usable energy, or if you will, the bricks will tend not to be organized, but to disorganization. Therefore, if there had been endless cycles of bangs and crunches and bangs and crunches, then long ago we would have run out of energy. We live in a relatively young universe. It's going to be billions of years old before our star runs out of juice. But if there had already been endless, non-ending, examples of crunches and bangs, then there is only a finite amount of energy. And soon that energy would become useless. But it's not. And the only real conclusion is that entropy undermines the theory of the oscillating universe. We're going to now take a little bit of a left turn. My atheistic friend tells me matter matters to atheists. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? They are, after all, at their heart and soul, materialists. But what these next arguments do, when they get in a pinch and they can't figure out a material way to make an uncaused cause, first cause material, then they tend to get metaphysical. Their arguments will tend to become all of a sudden kind of like out of this world. Or, if you will, metaphysical means beyond the material world, beyond the material world. Unfortunately, when you go metaphysical as a materialist, you also go beyond material evidence. But you just told me that matter matters. But you're looking for solutions in worlds that we cannot measure and or obtain data from. Material evidence from another dimension or outside of this universe is not verifiable. But in a pinch, when you're trying to degrade the Big Bang, it doesn't really seem to matter. Notice there's no notes on this, it's just a setup slide. It turns out Vilenkin isn't the only one who is uncomfortable with his previous discovery. I give you Stephen Hawking. Remember Stephen Hawking? He gave us the singularity theorem, which gave and gives good data and support to the Big Bang, to an absolute beginning. He also was uncomfortable with this. Back to the drawing board he goes, and years later, in his book, The Grand Design, shares with all of us what comes to be called the Hartle-Hawking theorem. This is a group of mathematical formulas, kind of like the BVG theorem. And what it suggests, or what he wants it to suggest, is If the universe is completely self-contained, meaning it had no beginning, had no end, then, well, no creator, no God, right? No bang, no creator, no God. The thing he brings to the table is a new fascination with a new form of physics and mathematics called quantum mechanics. String theory will also be in there, but in this particular case, quantum mechanic calculations. He brings this, and he's hoping that through a new mathematical approach that he would be able to design a theorem that would say, hey, uh, the universe doesn't need a singularity. So let's see how he does. The heart and the soul of the Hartle-Hawking theorem is this, that instead of an absolute beginning, that what was present at the start of our universe was some sort of a wave or a wave function. And that if you combine quantum mechanics and if there are pre-existing conditions, real conditions like gravity, and that mathematics works, and that all the calculations that he's going to do really work, then he jumps to an interesting conclusion. He basically eliminates the singularity by saying the following. If this quantum wave thing exists that needs all kinds of pre-existing conditions, then spontaneous creation is the reason why there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, because there is a law such as gravity. So that's one of the essential pre-exist. Gravity's got to exist before the Big Bang. Where does gravity come from? He doesn't know. Okay, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Does he have any experiments where gravity creates something? No. He just says with his little calculator and speculation that quantum mechanics and pre-exist, poof, we don't need a bang. And sorry, I goofed. There was no Big Bang because I got quantum mechanics and spontaneous generation or creation. Oh my goodness. He sells millions of books. This grand design book. I had people calling me saying, "Oh, I lost my faith. Science says we don't need a Big Bang. We've always been here." Yeah, we're gonna have to take a little serious look at the Hartle-Hawking theorem. Well, it doesn't and didn't take long for the Hartle-Hawking theorem to get into some trouble. And some of it fairly was because of what Stephen Hawking said about it himself. First, let's be clear. Calculations, no matter whether they're quantum physics or on your computer or in your calculator, can't create anything. What the Hartle-Hawking theorem can only do is to measure effects that occur outside of his theorem. Quantum physics, again, is just a tool that can measure effects. What Stephen Hawking was implying was that the Hartle-Hawking theorem could create effects, but then he shares what I think is the critical flaw in the Hartle-Hawking theorem. At the end of the book, he admits that in order to make his Hartle-Hawking theorem work, he had to use what in mathematics circles is called imaginary data. Data that isn't real. Data that isn't truly part of the world we measure. Not only did he have to use imaginary data to make his calculations work, but his program is dependent on not just one, but a number of pre-existent universal laws and rules to exist prior to the Big Bang. Well, we have no way of knowing if they do or don't, but they would be necessary for his theory or hypothesis to function. You got to have things like gravity and the speed of light, and math. 1 plus 1 has to equal 2. Well, this is all pre-bang, so we don't have any way to validate that that's what happened. Okay, for me, this is one of the more unsettling realities that I face when I'm dealing with what I will call scientific materialists who want to reject the existence of God for some sort of alternative view. Hawking, again, as I said, has to use imaginary data and pre-existent conditions for his calculations to work. But he understands and admits the following. Only if we live in imaginary time would we encounter no singularities. In real time, the universe has a beginning and an end at singularity. Just like the BVG theorem says, just like his own singularity theorem says, he knows that he's using quantum theory gimmicks. He knows he's doing it. But he's so opposed to anything that would suggest God exists that he's willing to be relative about it, and he's willing to be loosey-goosey with the facts because in his mind that's better than having to accept the objective truth that, oh my goodness gracious, the universe may have had an absolute beginning, which would then demand some sort of uncaused cause that isn't quantum physics. So even this smart cowboy who knows he's playing around one doesn't want to admit the facts say that the universe had a beginning and therefore it needed a cause, and the cause must be uncaused, and it's not material, and it's not mathematics, even quantum mechanic mathematics. I've already introduced the idea of an argument from ignorance, which says if we argue X, but X is unproven, it doesn't solve Y. Using X proves literally nothing. So let's apply the argument from ignorance to what Hawkins has proposed. Imaginary numbers and spontaneous generation simply mean that his absolute proofs do not exist. And so his Hartle-Hawking theory is based upon unproven and unprovable foundations. And his Hartle-Hawking theory there, technically speaking, is an argument from ignorance. Oh goody, this is one of my favorite ones. This is Lawrence Krauss, and he is the author of a book called A Universe from Nothing. Now, the first thing you need to understand is he believes that there's never been nothing, okay? He believes that somehow there has always been something, although they can't prove it. His most likely candidate for this something are mysterious, what he calls and what are called virtual particles, subatomic particles that that in recent times, as they do subatomic particle, and that's why we're going to call this the subatomic particle argument, there are mysterious particles that seemingly, when we get to the lowest levels, they seemingly pop in and out of our knowledge. They pop in and out of our existence. Well, of course, this will lend itself to maybe they're from another dimension. Maybe they're from another thing. But okay. But he publishes this book that says, again, with a number of pre-existing conditions and these subatomic particles, because after all, we know that from the atom comes a big explosion, nuclear energy kind of thing. Maybe these subatomic particles pop in and out from wherever it is they're popping in and out of, and maybe they bang the bang. And then he makes these outrageously confident statements that says he guarantees that the laws of quantum theory will create something. And maybe that something led or is or was the Big Bang. Fascinating idea. He sold a lot of books, by the way. Um, and hopefully in class I'll have some chance to let him take a shot at explaining his idea himself. But I think I've done some justice to it. That there's never been nothing, that there are these particles that exist. Okay, they bang the bang. Okay, well, it's an intriguing idea. These subatomic particles, maybe they banged the bang. Okay, so that's this idea. Well, problem number one is that the scientific community is divided. It's not the theological community, it's the scientific community that is divided on whether or not these quote unquote virtual particles are real. Or, kind of like Stephen Hawking's imaginary numbers, whether or not these are just mathematical tricks and gimmicks that are used to make an equation make more sense. So so are these strings in string theory, or do they exist, or are they, as this article suggests, expressions of how the agent experiences it? But let's assume for a minute, okay, these particles do exist. But if they're particles, that means they're stuff. And if they're stuff, that means they occupy, however small, they occupy some degree of time and space, enough so that at some points we are able to detect them. Well, that means that they are some type of material substance, however small. And then now that brings us back to a lot of the laws that we've been talking about. For instance, matter can't create itself. So where did they come from? What if you will banged their bang? And even if we accept that they exist, then begs the question, well, are they capable of banging the bang? Because a law of cause says that the cause has to be greater than the effect. So do these subatomic virtual particles have the ability to create the bang in the first place that then will come and create all this order within the universe? Then you've got a third problem. For any and all of this to exist, like Hawking's theory, there have to exist pre-existing universal laws. Gravity, speed of light, mathematics has to work. All of these subatomic particles have to build upon order and patterns and forces that work in a cohesive fashion with each other, in a complex and cohesive form and fashion. So you've got at least three theoretical things that have to be working together, or his idea has no starting spot merit. So purely theoretical, and, and the particles may not exist in the first place. In this era of the Avengers and Thanos and Doctor Strange and the multiverse, okay, we got to talk about string theory. And I'm going to hopefully show you a video from a physicist who has some fame. His name is Michio Kaku, and he tried to use bubbles. So I'm going to use that on my quiz name, the bubbles, to help him explain quantum physics and string theory and how it might have theoretically given us the Big Bang. Okay, the idea is that string theory and quantum physics, that one of these bubbles that a multiverse generator created, as Kaku said, maybe it's like a bubble bath, two bubbles collided, maybe one bubble split in half, maybe he says the universe uh, popped into existence out of nothing. So string theory has generated all these theoretical approaches in opposition to people like St. Thomas Aquinas's motion arguments, etc., etc. Like a little bit of these mysterious particles that Lawrence Krauss talked about, here's the problem. String theory has now been around for a long time, and it seems to be a compelling, I'm quoting now, it's a compelling tool to study particles that don't seem to obey these Newtonian physics, i.e. Krauss's, mysterious particles. However, its predictions are untestable and require enormous assumptions that are unsupported by an iota of scientific evidence. So again, these theoretical bubble models might be intriguing, but scientifically they're untestable. So why are they so popular? Let's take a quicker look. Okay, for purposes of our quiz and our test, we're going to associate Michio Kaku and all the configurations of what are called the multiverse universe theories, or M theories. And I'm going to argue that these things are metaphysical arguments. Literally, they are out of our world. And that is one of their strengths. Our world is constrained by laws of physics and laws of cause. Well, other dimensions might not have the same laws of physics. They might not have the same laws. So maybe there's a whole lot more flexibility in those other dimensions and in those other opportunities. So the strengths of, for instance, a multiverse generator, so all multiverse theories start with that in the multiverse, there must or could or is a multiverse generator that is spitting out millions and millions of different universes. And the more millions of billions of universes that are spit out, the better your chances that our universe would be birthed. And then all it's got to do is somehow bridge the gap from that dimension, into our dimension. Again, metaphysical, because all these things are in another dimension that are non-physical. Okay, so our universe only has a 14 billion year time span. Well, that may seem like a long time, but these things take billions and billions of years to achieve. And then plus string theory, as I say, and quantum physics are mathematically intriguing. Well, first of all, this is all theoretical. So we've got a multiverse generator that is producing multitudes, and that's what this, just multitudes of universes. And the idea is that one of these universes was ours and banged into existence and then somehow bridged the dimension gap into our dimension, if you will. That when it comes into our dimension, that's the Big Bang. Does everyone understand the theory? I hope so. So lots of multiverses. Well, let's take a look and critique some of the problems with this idea. So let's rephrase this. In order to get around the pesky laws of physics that exist in our universe, let's theorize that our Earth, our universe, had its origins originally in another universe that had a lot more generous opportunities. Okay, so you got a multi-universal generator generating billions and billions of universes, one of which is ours, and ours is going to jump from that dimension into ours. There's still a lot of problems. Let's focus in on the fact that there would have to be preconditions here that are the same as necessary preconditions there. And when scientists and mathematicians have begun to seriously look at the issue, the bridging of this dimension gap turns out to be formidable. that there has to be complementary. Just look at some of these things. Our universe can emerge. Variables in time for quantum mechanical mathematics, laws of gravity have to operate the same here and here. There has to be zero energy mass. There has to be a number of things that exist here that allow this thing to go from here to here. And it turns out that that particular problem is monumental. It is not a small potato. There's all kinds of complexities about even theoretically merging one dimension to another. But in addition to all of those pre-existing condition problems, the one single most pernicious issue in the inverse multiverse generator theory is this. It has to do with the multiverse generator that is the primary causation generator. That thing which produces all of the multiple billions and billions of universes. That original generator. Okay. Uh, now, the problem is that for this to have relevance, our universe would have to have the exact, they can't come from nowhere. So this universe would have had to have the same physical and universal properties that this universe has, because cause has to be greater than the effect. We would have to have the same physical laws. It would have to have the same chemical makeups. Well, now we're back to the BVG theorem. That means this universe was produced from a bang, from an absolute beginning. That's the problem. Well, that would imply this universe, to be relevant, also has to have a singularity that creates it. It can't just poof into nothing. So problem number one is, how do you explain the beginning of the universe generator that is going to generate our universe? Its complexity, its stupendousy, okay? This thing also leads us to the problem of complexity. This thing would have to be greater than this. This thing has to be as, if not more complex than our universe. And that is a huge, huge task. And that takes us to one of our final laws, the law of probability. The law of probability says as complexity goes up, the chance of accident goes down. So as complexity goes down, the probability of accident goes up. But all of these multiverse theories are very complex. They involve thousands, millions, millions of millions of intricate complexities that would have to align and move back and forth with each other. And the law of probability says as your complexity goes up, your chance of all of this happening by undirected, material, undirected chance are literally, I would argue, the chances of all of these things by accident occurring are out of this world. It's not possible. It's impossible. You can't rationally make this argument. If complexity impacts credibility and design, then you've got to legitimately be a little skeptical of these things, because these ideas are incredibly complex, but they would all have to happen by mere chance, undirected. That's a tough one. I will now formally introduce the idea of the argument of intelligent design. So, as complexity goes up, the opportunity for accident goes down. So, do I, as a Catholic, have to, out of hand, reject all elements of all of these theoretical suppositions? And the answer is no, I really don't. What I can, however, rely upon is this, is that I can prove and demonstrate that all these quantum theories would need incredibly complex pre-existent causes to exist. Things that we can't explain or understand, but we know they would be, by design, incredibly complex. And they would have to exist in places that we can't really factually qualify, but they would have to exist for these things to work. And so then what I get to argue is this. Okay, let's assume for a moment that you're right, that the multiverse exists, that the mysterious particles of Lawrence Krauss have the capability to bang the bang, that somehow the Hartle-Hawking theory can replace the BVG and the Big Bang idea. Even so, you would have to get all of those things off the ground to bang the bang. Let's assume you could prove that. Well, then you still got the following problem. Would the best explanation for all of this complexity be accident, or would a much better explanation be, no, they are the products of intelligent design? Ooh. So even if I grant you, okay, mysterious particles did it. The bubbles. Yeah, Michio Kaku, your bubbles. They did it, splitting right in half. And then came from one dimension to another. Yep, did it. The complexity in our universe alone, now you've multiplied our universe's complexity with another universe and dimension's complexity. Would the best explanation for the existence of those things be accident or design? And as we will see in the next section, what I'm going to argue is if you answer design, then there must be a designer. All right, God bless. Here we go.